When the first jolt shook the train, most dismissed it as nothing. The second came, and unease flickered across worried faces. But when the third struck, sharp, unnatural, deliberate, every eye held the same unspoken question. Was this just a malfunction, or was someone pulling the strings? That night, in the dimly lit corridors of the doomed train, only one person refused to believe this was an accident. The evidence was too neat, too convenient. Someone had ensured that this train would never reach its destination, and had done so in a way that would make it seem like mere misfortune. But they had made one mistake. Every lie, no matter how perfect, leaves behind a trace of truth. And I know exactly where to look. The express train roared through the moonlit countryside, its polished steel frame gleaming under the silver glow of the night. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks should have been a comfort, a familiar lullaby to the engineer who had spent decades mastering these very rails. And yet, tonight, something was different. A chill hung in the air, unnatural and heavy, wrapping around him like unseen fingers pressing against his throat. Inside the dimly lit engine room, the man sat stiffly, his gloved hands gripping the controls with knuckle-whitening force. The dials flickered, the gauges held steady, the speedometer needle rested exactly where it should, but still unease coiled in his gut like a serpent, tightening with every breath. His ruddy complexion had paled, beads of sweat collecting at his temple despite the cold. And then movement, just beyond the curve of his vision. He turned sharply, his eyes snapping to the cabin's small window, expecting to see only the reflection of his own worn face. But what he saw instead stole the breath from his lungs. Another face, a shadowed figure just behind him, faint, distorted in the dim light, watching him with hollow, unblinking eyes. His breath hitched, his pulse spiking as a cold shudder ripped through him. In a panic, he spun around, his chair screeching against the floor. Nothing. The cabin was empty, the only sound the relentless hum of the powerful engine. His chest heaved, mind racing. Had he imagined it? Or was someone lurking just beyond his reach? Before he could steady himself, the train lurched violently, a sudden jarring impact. A deafening metallic groan tore through the night. As the wheels screeched against the rails, the engineer's chair toppled, sending him crashing against the console. The lights flickered. Champagne glasses shattered in the dining car. Passengers screamed. China plates slid off tables and exploded into shards against the floor. A plume of steam hissed from the engine, the monstrous machine fighting against its own momentum. The train shuddered, its mighty power faltering, until finally, it came to a bone-rattling halt. And then silence. A suffocating, eerie stillness. The night outside had transformed. Smoke curled like ghostly fingers against the window, twisting in the moonlight. The distant trees stood unnaturally still, their blackened silhouettes pressing against the horizon like silent sentinels. Inside the cabin, the engineer lay slumped over the controls, his breath shallow, his body limp. His wide, terrified eyes stared unseeing into the muted glow of the gauges. But on the fogged-up glass of the window, something new had appeared. A message, hastily scrawled by a trembling finger. It wasn't me. Back in the grand salon, chaos reigned. Tables lay overturned, delicate china reduced to jagged shards across the plush carpet. Passengers, some trembling, some wide-eyed with shock, clung to the remnants of their composure. Well-dressed women clutched their handbags like lifelines. Men barked sharp, panicked questions at the train staff, demanding answers no one could provide. And in the midst of it all, one woman stood, still composed, her presence a quiet but undeniable force. Detective Agatha Marple, small in stature but formidable in presence. She adjusted her silver-rimmed spectacles, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. She noted everything, the half-spilled champagne dripping onto velvet upholstery, the abandoned gold watch gleaming under the chandelier's fractured light, the conductor standing rigid in the doorway, his face ashen with fear. Her mind worked quickly, dissecting the scene with the ruthless efficiency of a surgeon. "Let's have some calm now," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. It cut through the thick fog of panic, drawing eyes to her. A young woman, barely holding back sobs, clutched at her pearls with trembling fingers. Agatha stepped forward, slipping a crisp handkerchief from her sleeve and pressing it gently into the girl's hands. "Deep breaths," she murmured, her voice softer now. "We'll have this sorted in no time." The girl nodded, her breath evening out. Around them the ripple of hysteria began to still, but Agatha's gaze had already moved on. She saw the details others missed. The way the conductor's hands trembled as he clutched his cap. The way his eyes darted, not with confusion, but with knowing. He was afraid, yes, but not of the accident itself, of something more. Agatha took a step toward him. He flinched. "Something dreadful has happened, hasn't it?" she asked, her tone measured, controlled, but beneath it lay a sharp, undeniable edge. The conductor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Madam," he stammered, "please return to your seat." She didn't move, didn't blink. "The train stopped suddenly," she continued, as if speaking to herself. "Not a derailment, or we'd have felt the angle. Not a mechanical failure, or we'd have heard a warning. Something stopped us. Something deliberate." She glanced at the shattered remnants of the dining car, at the frozen faces of the passengers, and judging by the look on your face, you know exactly what. The conductor's lips parted, as if to protest, but no words came. Agatha gave a small, wry smile. The storm had passed. But she knew another was already brewing. The train moved through the night, like a silent spectre, its rhythm steady, but carrying an unspoken tension, as if the very air could sense the storm brewing ahead. But then, without warning, a violent jolt, a screeching metallic protest, and a sudden halt that left behind an eerie, unnatural silence. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of steam, curling into the cold night like a ghostly whisper. Agatha Marple, who had been quietly observing the passengers from her seat, was the first to rise. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. The nervous glances, the stiffened postures, the hushed murmurs that spread like ripples through the compartments. Yet it was the conductor she focused on, his face drained of color, his hands twitching, as if resisting the urge to grip something for support. The reason for this sudden stop. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something undeniable, command. The conductor hesitated, his lips parting as if to explain, but no words came. Instead, he motioned forward, a silent invitation for her to follow. They moved through the narrow corridor, past rows of uneasy passengers, pressing themselves against the windows, searching the darkness for answers. The further they went, the heavier the air became, thick with something acrid, the sharp tang of metal and smoke. Agatha noticed it immediately, the faint stench of something overheated, something wrong. Ahead, the engine compartment loomed, its door slightly ajar. From within, there was only stillness, a kind of absence that was more unsettling than chaos. The conductor swallowed hard, and pushed the door open, revealing a space no longer pristine, but marred by something sudden, something violent. The controls, usually aligned in mechanical precision, were askew, levers jammed in unnatural positions, dials twitching, as if caught in an unseen tremor. And there, against the console, the engineer slumped motionless. His uniform was as it should be, except for the dark stain spreading from his collar. One hand rested loosely on the lever, the other lay limp at his side, fingers frozen mid-motion, his glove slightly askew. His face, pale and contorted, bore an expression of something unfinished, something abruptly ended, but Agatha's gaze wasn't on his face. It was on the console, where amidst the thin layer of dust, something had been written, rough, uneven letters scratched into the surface, as if by a trembling hand. "It wasn't me." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the conductor cleared his throat nervously. "It's a tragedy, miss. A terrible, quiet." Agatha interrupted, her voice firm, but gentle. She adjusted her spectacles, stepping closer, her sharp eyes scanning the jagged strokes of the message, the smear left by the engineer's glove. Behind her the conductor shifted uncomfortably. "He's gone, you see. Looks as though he faltered, swallowed. No one could have survived that." "But not," Agatha murmured, unreadable. She straightened, turning slowly to face the conductor, whose ashen face betrayed his unease. "Tell me something. Why would a man, in his final moments, write these words? Why not a farewell, or a plea for help?" The conductor opened his mouth, then closed it again, no answer forming. Agatha stepped back, folding her hands neatly over her handbag. "You'll want to notify the authorities," she said coolly. "I'll handle the passengers, keep them calm, prevent any unnecessary commotion." Then after a pause, she added, "And one more thing, if there's anyone aboard who knew the engineer well, have them come forward. We'll need to understand his state of mind before the crash." Without another word, she turned and disappeared down the corridor, leaving the conductor standing there, staring at the message left by a dead man. Beyond the engine room, the train was unnervingly still, frozen in time. The faint whisper of escaping steam curled into the night air, carrying with it the remnants of whatever had transpired. A fine layer of dust, disturbed by the sudden stop, had settled over the polished brass fixtures, the once luxurious sheen of the train dulled, as if the tragedy itself had seeped into its very bones. In the dining car, passengers huddled in tense clusters, their conversations a low murmur of fear and speculation. The wealthier travelers sat stiffly, their evening finery, a stark contrast to their pale, uneasy faces, while those from the lower compartments stood near the doors, glancing about as if expecting an unseen threat to emerge from the shadows. A steward moved among them, offering water and soft words of reassurance, words that vanished as quickly as they were spoken. And in the midst of it all, Agatha Marple sat quietly, hands folded over her bag, her gaze fixed not on the faces around her, but on the invisible threads of the mystery already beginning to take shape. The train was no longer merely a means of travel. It had become a crime scene. The train lay frozen on the tracks, its once proud steel body now a silent sentinel against the creeping night. The opulence of its interiors, gilded chandeliers, mahogany paneling, velvet drapes, had taken on a strangely theatrical quality, as if the grand stage of travel had transformed into a crime scene before its unsuspecting audience. The scent of burnt oil and steam still clung to the air, heavy and acrid, seeping into the fine linens and expensive upholstery. A ghostly hush had settled over the passengers, their initial murmurs fading into anxious watching silence. Agatha Everleigh sat with quiet composure in the dining car, her hands resting lightly on her handbag, her blue eyes keen behind silver-rimmed spectacles. She had seen enough before the authorities arrived. The engineer's slumped figure, his face locked in a grimace of pain or fear, the gloved hand still curled against the console, the levers frozen in a position no engineer would willingly leave them in. But most of all she had seen the message. Scrawled in the dust of the control panel, uneven and frantic, as though etched by a trembling hand. "It wasn't me." Outside, just beyond the threshold of the car, the conductor and a constable conferred in hushed tones, their figures dimly outlined by the flickering glow of the gas lamps. Agatha did not need to hear every word to know the nature of their exchange. Uncertainty, speculation and fear. The conductor was trying to explain what could not be explained. "Perhaps he lost control," he murmured, though his own voice wavered with doubt. "The brakes, they failed, I think." His sentence trailed into uneasy silence. The constable, a heavy-set man with a perpetually furrowed brow, frowned as he jotted notes into a worn leather notebook. Agatha watched them both without moving. The conductor's hand shook slightly as he gestured, his eyes flicking, not to the cabin where the body still lay, but toward the shattered glass in the corridor, as if expecting something unseen to emerge. Inside the dining car, the passengers were unraveling under the weight of the unknown. A stout woman in a mink stole whispered frantically to a bespectacled gentleman in a rumpled suit, her nervous fingers clutching the stem of her untouched wine glass. A younger man, his collar askew and his hair damp with sweat, tapped his foot incessantly against the polished floor, his eyes darting toward the corridor every few seconds. An elegantly dressed matron with a string of pearls sat stiff-backed in her seat, her hands clasped in prayer, lips moving soundlessly. At the far end of the car, however, one passenger remained poised, too poised. Lady Vivienne Travers sat in an undisturbed corner, her emerald dress unwrinkled, her expression serene as a portrait framed in gold. Yet her fingers, delicate, manicured, kept straying to the locket at her throat, tracing its edges with a touch too practiced, too deliberate. Agatha's gaze sharpened. A nervous habit, or a silent confession, rising from her seat with the grace of someone who preferred to go unnoticed. Agatha approached, her voice light but precise. "An unfortunate evening, wouldn't you say?" Lady Vivienne looked up, her dark lashes fluttering just slightly before she met Agatha's gaze with a polished smile. "Quite dreadful," she replied smoothly. "One never expects such incidents on a train of this caliber." A rehearsed response, too carefully measured. Agatha let the silence stretch, watching the way Lady Vivienne's grip on the locket tightened, barely but enough. Beyond them, the train remained still, frozen in time like a riddle waiting to be solved. The answers were here, scattered like shards of broken glass. Agatha only needed to gather them, one piece at a time. The train remained unnervingly still, a mechanical beast halted in its tracks, its lifeblood of steam and fire choked into eerie silence. In the dining car, once a scene of quiet indulgence, the atmosphere had thickened, the clink of fine china, and the murmur of polite conversation replaced by strained whispers and wary glances. The air smelled of burnt oil, and something less tangible, fear perhaps, or the faint lingering trace of death. The polished wood paneling seemed darker under the dim brass lighting, and the shattered remnants of a crystal glass on the floor glinted like fallen stars, unnoticed in the wake of greater concerns. Agatha Everly observed all of this with practiced calm, her gloved hands folded neatly over her lap, her silver-rimmed spectacles catching the flickering glow of the lamps. She had seen much already, the lifeless body of the engineer slumped over his controls, the message scrawled in the dust of the console, "It wasn't me." A desperate plea, a confession, a warning. The questions wound through her mind like a thread waiting to be pulled. And then, there were the passengers, each one caught in the tangled web of this unforeseen disaster, some whispering, some waiting, some hiding. But from what, or whom? At a table near the far end, Lady Evelyn Armitage, regal in her emerald dress, sat with the composure of a woman accustomed to control. Yet the careful placement of her hands, the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly as they traced the edge of the delicate locket at her throat, did not escape Agatha's notice. The locket itself, small and unassuming, gleamed dully under the dining car's wavering light. The moment an older gentleman nearby muttered the engineer's name, Evelyn's lips tightened at the corners, a minute reaction but one that spoke volumes. Agatha took her time before approaching, weaving through the uneasy hush of the carriage like a spectre of inquiry. "Quite the unfortunate turn of events," she remarked, her tone light yet edged with purpose. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Agatha Everly, a pleasure, despite the circumstances." Lady Evelyn turned, her expression smoothing into something polite, detached. "Indeed. Evelyn Armitage. A most unfortunate night. Have you taken this route before?" Agatha asked, watching carefully. "Oh, once or twice," Evelyn replied, a flicker of hesitation betraying her. Her fingers brushed the locket again. "Only once or twice?" Agatha tilted her head slightly, as though puzzled. "I could have sworn I heard you mention frequent business travel." A second hesitation, almost imperceptible, but Agatha caught it. A breath too long, a flicker of lashes lowered before Evelyn corrected herself. Ah yes, of course, business. But not on this particular route. I must have misspoken, a mistake, and she knew it. The grip on her locket tightened before her hand dropped away, smoothing the folds of her dress in a practiced gesture of control. Across the car, Charles Devlin sat hunched over a pile of documents, his movements sharp and economical. The American businessman exuded an energy that was too tense, too restrained, as if his chair was too small and his thoughts too heavy. His fingers shuffled the papers methodically, yet when anyone passed too near, his body stiffened, his gaze flicking over his shoulder toward Lady Evelyn. Agatha watched for a moment before drifting closer. "Unsettling, isn't it?" she murmured, noting the way his grip on his papers tightened before he forced himself to look up. "Yes," he muttered, barely sparing her a glance. "Unsettling indeed. Quite the disruption to one's plans," Agatha mused. Devlin's gaze flicked to her just for a second, but it was long enough. "You could say that, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." His hand clenched over his briefcase, his jaw tight, his entire posture screaming guardedness. But it wasn't just business secrecy that shadowed his features, it was something more, something heavier, and whatever it was he was glancing at Lady Evelyn as though it might somehow implicate her. Agatha moved on, weaving past hushed conversations and anxious murmurs until she reached the far end of the car, where a younger man sat alone. His disheveled appearance, tousled brown hair, tie askew, would have seemed merely careless, were it not for the anxious way he fidgeted with the napkin in his lap. But what caught Agatha's eye was the faint smear on his cuff, something dark, something slick, grease, perhaps, or something else. "Good evening," she greeted, her voice warm yet probing. "You're the inventor, aren't you? I hear you were involved in the train's design." The young man's head snapped up, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, that's correct. I was part of the team, not the chief designer of course, just an assistant, but a very knowledgeable one, I'm sure," Agatha said smoothly, her eyes flicking once more to his sleeve. "That looks like grease. Were you in the engine room recently?" He blinked, then instinctively pulled back his arm. "Oh that, I must have picked that up earlier. I was in the cabin just before we left the last station, just for a moment, and did everything appear in order?" A hesitation, just long enough. "Yes, everything seemed fine." Another pause, his fingers twisting the napkin. "I didn't stay long, just a few minutes really. Then I came back here for dinner." His hands clenched, then unclenched. There was something he wasn't saying, something caught between what he claimed and what he knew. Agatha nodded as if satisfied, but as she turned away, she filed each detail away carefully. Evelyn's locket, Devlin's guarded glances, the inventor's oil-stained sleeve. The pieces were assembling, shifting into place. The air in the dining car remained thick with unease, the scent of candle wax, dust, and simmering nerves hanging over the passengers like an invisible noose. The train, once a vessel of movement, now sat frozen in time, the mystery unraveling thread by thread. And Agatha Everly intended to pull every single one. The train had lurched to an unexpected halt, its carriages groaning softly in protest, and yet within the opulent dining car, an unnatural hush had settled. The velvet drapes trembled ever so slightly, the only sign that the locomotive still possessed a heartbeat beneath its frozen exterior. At one of the elegantly adorned tables, a woman draped in midnight blue, Lady Eleanor Whitmore, sat with an air of refined composure, her fingers absently toying with the delicate stem of her wine glass. Across the car, the infamous industrialist Harold Lysander leaned forward, his deep-set eyes locked onto a map spread over the table, his lips pressed into a thin, unsmiling line. A faint tension rippled beneath the subdued elegance of the scene, as if the very air carried the weight of unspoken secrets. Agatha Marple observed it all, with practiced detachment, her gaze drifting from one passenger to the next, cataloguing every nervous glance, every gesture too calculated to be truly casual. She had long believed that silence often revealed more than words, and tonight that belief held true. A sharp laugh broke the quiet, a laugh that did not belong. Seated near the window, a man in a pinstriped suit, a newspaper magnate, if memory served, chuckled under his breath, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany of the table. But his amusement never reached his eyes. Agatha tilted her head slightly, intrigued. Somewhere near the rear of the car, a steward hesitated before clearing away an untouched plate, his movements a shade too deliberate, as if measuring the weight of the room. Beyond him, a woman in pearl earrings fidgeted with her scarf, her gaze darting toward the carriage doors every few seconds. Outside, the darkness pressed against the glass, an impenetrable wall of ink, its stillness unnatural. Something was very wrong. The train had stopped, but why? Agatha smoothed a gloved hand over the edge of the linen tablecloth, and rose gracefully to her feet, her expression composed yet watchful. As she took a step forward, a rustle of movement caught her attention. Lysander, abandoning his map at last, pushing his chair back with barely a whisper of sound. His departure should have been unremarkable, but Agatha noticed the tension in his shoulders, the brief flicker of calculation in his gaze before he turned toward the corridor. Was he leaving to investigate, or to hide something? The faintest hint of smoke lingered in the air, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Not the warm, inviting scent of cigars so common among these wealthy travelers, but something sharper. Oil, machinery, the scent of something disturbed. Her mind worked swiftly, connecting invisible threads. Then, just as she took another step, the silence was broken by a distant sound, a low metallic groan, as if something within the depths of the train was stirring. A murmur passed through the passengers, a ripple of unease spreading beneath the veneer of civility. Agatha exhaled slowly. The pieces were shifting, the mystery unfolding before her eyes, and whatever lay ahead, she was ready. The midnight hush had settled thick over the train, a deceptive calm draped over the luxurious corridors like a velvet shroud, masking the tension that crackled beneath the surface. Agatha Marple sat in the dimly lit dining car, her silver-rimmed spectacles catching the low glow of the overhead lamps as she pressed her fingers together in thought. The delicate hum of the engine had faded into the background, barely perceptible beneath the weight of the unknown. The passengers had long since withdrawn, either to their compartments or into uneasy silence, but Agatha remained vigilant, her mind methodically piecing together the disjointed fragments of the puzzle taking shape around her. Every detail, no matter how minute, could hold the key. A sharp clink of china punctuated the stillness, the sound of a teacup meeting its saucer with just enough force to betray the nerves of the steward clearing the last of the untouched plates. His movements were efficient, yet the tension in his posture did not escape Agatha's notice. His hands, though steady, trembled slightly as he gathered the porcelain, and every few moments his eyes flickered toward the corridor, as if expecting someone, or dreading their arrival. Agatha watched him carefully, her gaze dissecting every nuance of his demeanor. Was it merely the weight of the night's events pressing on him, or did he know more than he let on? She rose, her steps slow and deliberate as she approached him. An unsettling evening, wouldn't you say? Her voice was gentle but edged with purpose. The steward hesitated for just a fraction too long before nodding. "Quite so, madam. You must know this train well," she continued conversationally. "And yet something about tonight seems different." His grip on the tray tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, I suppose. The delay, of course. And before that." Agatha's tone remained casual, though her scrutiny sharpened. "Anything else unusual?" For a moment, his composure wavered. "Nothing I can speak to, madam." A cryptic answer, not a denial, but a careful avoidance. Before she could press further, a sound broke the fragile quiet, a door creaking faintly at the far end of the car. Instinctively Agatha turned just in time to glimpse a figure slipping into the shadows of the corridor, the hem of a dark coat disappearing beyond the threshold. With measured steps she followed. The air grew denser as she moved, the scent of tobacco curling faintly in the stagnant corridor, leading her toward a partially open cabin door. Whoever had been here had not intended to linger. Agatha paused just outside, listening, her breath held against the heavy silence. No movement, no voices. Slowly she pushed the door open a fraction more, and stepped inside. The cabin was pristine, too pristine. The bed remained untouched, the luggage neatly arranged, not a single item out of place. But something was off. Her keen eyes swept space, and then she saw it. A single glass on the table, beads of condensation forming on its surface, as though abandoned in haste. Someone had been here recently. Then another detail, a glove, ivory and elegant, lying just beneath the chair. It was a lady's evening glove, untouched by dust, its fingers poised as if dropped in mid-motion. But had it been carelessly left behind, or placed with intention? Not far from it, a torn scrap of paper peeked from beneath the seat cushion. She bent down, carefully pulling it free. The ink was smudged, the writing hurried and uneven, but one letter remained visible. A capital L. Agatha straightened, her mind cataloguing these details with the precision of a seasoned investigator. The glove, the letter, the abandoned drink, each a separate thread waiting to be woven into the fabric of the mystery. But before she could consider further, the sound of footsteps approached from the corridor. She turned sharply, listening. Steady, deliberate steps, moving toward her. Not hurried, but not casual either. Someone knew she was here. Just then, the train gave a sudden lurch, an unnatural groaning shudder reverberating through the walls. The lamps flickered, and the sensation of motion of a train that had been stationary for too long returned with an eerie hesitation. The timing was too precise. This was no ordinary delay. Someone had stopped the train for a reason, and Agatha Marple intended to find out why. The hush that had fallen over the train was deceptive, a fragile illusion of calm shattered only by the occasional hushed whisper or the distant creak of the carriage. Agatha Marple remained seated in the dining car, her slender fingers resting lightly against her lap as she watched the uneasy tide of movement around her. The scent of perfume and brandy still lingered in the air, but beneath it, something darker lurked. The acrid sting of tension. The passengers, their conversations hushed, stole wary glances toward one another, the comfortable air of aristocratic leisure, now soured by uncertainty. Someone among them knew more than they were willing to admit. Her eyes flickered toward the young inventor seated at a corner table, his wiry frame hunched over a spread of blueprints, the edges curling slightly beneath his restless fingers. A broken pen dangled between his fingertips, long dry but still turning idly between his hands. The dim light of the overhead sconces cast a faint sheen across his brow, and it was not simply from the warmth of the train. His cuff bore a faint grease stain, a mark of work done in haste. Agatha filed this detail away as she moved toward him. "Pardon me," she said in her usual measured tone, sliding into the seat across from him. The young man blinked, startled, his pen stilled mid-motion. "Oh yes, of course," he stammered, attempting to straighten. "You're with the engineering team, aren't you?" Agatha continued, her voice gentle but probing. "Assistant engineer," he corrected quickly, "but mostly I work on the mechanical systems. Not the driving or navigation, really, more the upkeep, the smaller parts." "Ah, so you'd know if something had been tampered with, wouldn't you?" The inventor hesitated, the grip on his pen tightening ever so slightly. "Well, nothing was tampered with, as far as I know," he said, his words carefully measured. "Just routine maintenance. One of the brake components was swapped out before the run, but that's normal procedure." Agatha's gaze remained unwavering. "Who replaced it?" I don't know," he admitted, shifting in his seat. "I assumed it was standard work, part of the checks before departure. Did you ask? A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. I didn't think to. Interesting, Agatha murmured, watching him with quiet scrutiny. And you didn't hear or notice anything out of place before departure? The young man shook his head a little too quickly. No, nothing at all. A lie perhaps, or at the very least, a deliberate omission. But Agatha merely gave a polite nod. Thank you, that will be all for now. She rose, returning to her seat, her mind swiftly cataloguing each thread she had gathered. The conductor's reluctant admission of an argument, the socialite's hesitant acknowledgement of raised voices, the young engineer's nervous avoidance, and now a brake part replaced by an unknown hand. The murmurs within the train grew heavier, the passengers clustering together in small groups like birds sensing an approaching storm. The warm glow of the carriages, once inviting, now felt suffocating under the weight of something unseen. The whispers were laced with apprehension, speculation threading its way through the opulent halls. Then the sudden sharp sound of a chair scraping against the floor tore through the uneasy quiet. Stolen, the voice thundered across the dining car, cutting through the stagnant air like a blade. Charles Devon, the American businessman, stood with his fists clenched, his expression twisted in barely restrained fury. Every eye turned toward him as he gestured sharply toward the briefcase he had placed on the table, its lid now gaping open like an empty mouth. My papers, he growled, gone. Agatha turned slightly, her gaze settling on him with quiet interest. The sheen of sweat along his temple, the rigid set of his jaw. He was furious, yes, but was it the righteous anger of a wronged man or the carefully placed outrage of someone playing a role? Minutes ago, he continued, voice rising, they were right here. I stepped away for a moment, and now, he stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing, as they swept across the room, as if searching for the guilty party among them. Are you certain they're missing? Agatha's voice, though calm, carried easily over the rising hum of speculation. Devon turned his glare on her. I don't misplace things, Miss Moreau. His voice was clipped, defensive. Someone took them, private contracts, sensitive agreements, and I intend to have them back. A thief in a sealed train, Agatha mused more to herself than to him. Quite a bold move. Devon's frown deepened, his stance shifting uneasily. What exactly are you implying? Only that whoever took them is still here, she said smoothly. And I imagine they must be rather nervous right now. For just a fraction of a second, Devon hesitated. His fingers twitched at his sides. Then, without another word, he stormed out of the dining car, his footsteps heavy against the polished floor. Around her, the passengers burst into fresh whispers, imaginations no doubt spinning visions of clandestine thieves and secret transactions. But Agatha's thoughts were elsewhere. A stolen briefcase, a swapped brake component, an argument overheard in hushed tones, the death of the engineer. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, aligning into something resembling a pattern, and Agatha Moreau intended to see exactly where they led. The midnight hour had settled over the luxurious train like a thick, suffocating veil. Outside, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the landscape in an inky abyss. The only sounds were the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks and the occasional rustle of fabric as passengers shifted in their sleep. Agatha Marple, however, was not sleeping. A subtle, almost imperceptible tremor had stirred her from her thoughts. Not a natural jolt of the train, but something else, something deliberately done. She sat up slowly, her keen senses absorbing every minute detail of the dimly lit compartment. There was an unusual scent in the air. Oil and metal, yes, but laced with something acrid, something that didn't belong. Silently, she rose from her seat and stepped into the corridor. The train's passageway was deserted, the ornate sconces casting flickering shadows against the polished mahogany walls. As she walked, she noted the telltale signs of something amiss. An abandoned pencil snapped in two, as if broken in a moment of tension, a bead of moisture slipping down the door handle of a compartment, suggesting it had been opened just moments ago. A faint footprint on the plush carpet, narrow and precise, left by someone wearing thin-soled shoes. Each clue was small, insignificant on its own, but together they painted a picture of a presence lurking within the train, someone who moved with caution, someone who did not wish to be seen. Her steps led her toward the engine room, drawn by a silent compulsion. The heavy door gave way with a slight push, revealing a dimly lit space filled with the lingering warmth of machinery and the ghost of recent movement. But it was not the lifeless dials and gauges that seized her attention. It was the body slumped over the control panel, frozen in his final moments. The engineer, his hand still clutched a lever, fingers slack but stained with grease, and there, smeared onto the metal surface before him, written in a trembling but deliberate hand, were the words, "This is only the beginning." Agatha's pulse quickened. A suicide note? No. The phrase didn't fit. If he had taken his own life, why protest? Why leave a cryptic warning, rather than a farewell? Her sharp eyes scanned the confined space, methodically absorbing the details. The scuff marks on the floor where a chair had been pushed back too forcefully, the faint imprint of a gloved hand smeared near the edge of the console, the nearly imperceptible specks of ash settled on the seat, despite the clear rule that no one was permitted to smoke here. And then, tucked just beneath the engineer's chair, something out of place, a small black notebook. Agatha knelt, careful not to disturb anything, and slid the notebook free. Its cover was worn, its edges softened from frequent use. She flipped it open, revealing densely packed pages filled with intricate diagrams and calculations, train schematics, mechanical adjustments, notes on maintenance, but something was missing. Several pages had been torn out, and not with care. The edges were jagged, uneven, ripped in haste. Her fingers ran lightly over the remaining sheets, feeling for indentations. Even though the missing pages were gone, their ghostly impressions remained. She angled the book toward the light, noting the alignment of the strokes, the crisp and measured handwriting. It was familiar. Her mind raced back to the young inventor she had spoken with earlier, the one who fidgeted with his pen, the one whose cuff had borne a smudge of grease. He had seemed nervous, evasive, dismissive of the swapped-out brake component, and yet his notes had looked eerily similar to the faded imprints on these missing pages. Had he seen this notebook before? Had he removed the pages himself? And if so, what was it that someone had been so desperate to erase? Before she could pursue that thought further, another jolt ran through the train, sharper this time, urgent, unnatural. It was the distinct lurch of an emergency brake being engaged. But why? Who had triggered it? And more importantly, what were they trying to stop or escape? Agatha's grip tightened around the notebook as she rose to her feet, her mind now working faster than ever. This was no longer just a case of murder. No, this was something far more intricate. A puzzle with pieces deliberately hidden, a game where every move was calculated. Someone on this train was orchestrating something far greater than a single death, and whatever it was, it had only just begun. The dim glow of a single swaying bulb cast restless shadows along the luggage car's narrow walls as Agatha Marple moved with measured intent through the forgotten nook of the train's anatomy. The air was thick with the scent of dust and aged wood, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the tracks below, a quiet hum of steel against steel vibrating beneath her boots. Here, among the neatly stacked trunks and leather-bound valises, was where secrets chose to hide in the overlooked corners, the crevices of human oversight. With gloved fingers, she sifted through a stack of documents resting haphazardly beside the conductor's log. Most were mundane, maintenance records, cargo inventories, lists of scheduled stops, but then her touch hesitated upon something different. A single yellowed invoice, slightly crumpled as if hurriedly discarded, its ink faded yet legible. A supplier's name from London. A transaction finalized weeks before departure, a bulk order of specialized braking components, exorbitantly priced even by railway standards. But it was not the sum that drew her suspicion, it was the recipient's name. It was not that of any known crew member, nor listed in the train's employment records. A pseudonym, a name deliberately chosen to exist without scrutiny. The sharp, angular strokes of the handwriting were eerily familiar, not identical to those in the deceased engineer's notebook, but similar to a signature she had glimpsed elsewhere, perhaps among the calculations of a certain young inventor. She slipped the document into her reticule just as a whisper of movement behind her sent a ripple of tension down her spine. Turning sharply, she found herself met by the poised figure of Madame Anouk Lemaire, the renowned actress, her velvet shawl wrapped tightly around her frame. Anouk stood out here, an anachronism in the starkly utilitarian setting, her elegance clashing against the bare wooden beams and cold steel fastenings. Yet her expression was not one of idle curiosity. It was apprehensive, searching. "I thought I might find you here," she murmured, her French lilted voice smooth, yet touched with an undertone Agatha could not immediately place. Agatha studied her with quiet scrutiny. "And why is that, Madame Lemaire?" The actress hesitated, gloved fingers tightening around the folds of her shawl. "I have been thinking of something I saw," she admitted, her words measured. "Something I dismissed at first." Agatha raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Anouk's gaze flickered, as if gauging how much to reveal. Then, as if reaching a decision, she stepped closer. "I was near the platform before departure, watching as the train was being prepared. The engineer boarded, tall, clean-shaven, uniform pressed to regulation. A forgettable sight, one of routine." She paused. "But then some time later, I was speaking with a station attendant on the other side of the platform, and I saw him again." Agatha's posture straightened, her grip tightening imperceptibly on the folded receipt in her palm. "The same man," she pressed. "That is what I believed, but something was amiss." Anouk's voice lowered, the weight of memory sharpening her words. "This time he was dressed differently. No uniform, just a plain jacket, a hat pulled low. It struck me as odd, but I did not think much of it until now." A slow breath escaped Agatha's lips. A second sighting. A man boarding the train twice in two distinct disguises, and the implications were damning. If the engineer or someone masquerading as him had changed attire before departure, then there had been a deliberate effort to mislead, a replacement, a switch, or something far more insidious. The pieces aligned in quick succession, the engineer's incomplete, hurried note on the control panel, the torn pages from his notebook, the unaccounted for brake components. None of it suggested a solitary act of desperation. This was not the work of one man crumbling under the weight of his conscience. It was an orchestrated deception, a methodical ploy veiled beneath layers of misdirection. Agatha met Anouk's gaze, her mind racing ahead of the conversation. "You are certain it was the same man?" Anouk nodded slowly. "As certain as one can be," she murmured, her tone no longer theatrical but heavy with realization. "The build, the posture, the gait, it was him, and yet it was not." The train lurched suddenly, an unnatural jolt that sent a shiver through the carriage, and for a fleeting moment, Agatha thought she glimpsed something flicker across Anouk's expression, fear perhaps, or something more veiled. But there was no time to unravel that. Not yet. The game had shifted. Someone aboard this train was not who they claimed to be, and the truth, whatever it was moving beneath the surface, a predator circling its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And Agatha Marple would not be caught unaware. A faint tremor ran through the midnight express, as it sliced through the dense fog shrouding the moors, its rhythmic clatter, a deceptive lullaby masking the storm of secrets within. In the dimly lit corridor of the third-class carriage, Evelyn Graves moved with quiet precision, her sharp gaze sweeping over the vacant seats, the discarded newspapers, the forgotten scarves, all the small telltale remnants of lives intersecting in transit. But she wasn't looking for lost belongings, she was hunting something or someone. A quiet whisper of air brushed past her ear as the compartment door at the far end clicked shut. Her pulse quickened. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers grazing the folded telegram she had received just hours before. Urgent. The target is aboard. Watch the baggage car. A name was absent. It always was, but Evelyn had been in this game long enough to read between the lines. This was no ordinary fugitive, no petty thief on the run. No, this was something far more intricate. Steeling herself, she slipped into the adjoining carriage, the cool metallic scent of the rails below mingling with the lingering fragrance of last night's spilled brandy. Beyond the velvet curtains lay the luggage car, a world apart from the luxury of the dining hall, a place where secrets could be stowed away and forgotten. The lantern overhead swayed, throwing restless shadows against the wooden crates and neatly stacked trunks. She moved between them, her breath steady, ears tuned to the hush of the train's movements. Then a whisper, a shuffle against leather. She turned sharply, a trunk near the back, slightly ajar, the lock forced. Her gloved fingers reached out, lifting the lid an inch. A glint of brass caught the light. A pocket watch, but not just any watch. The engraving was unmistakable, property of Colonel James Whittaker, the missing investigator. A surge of ice slid down her spine, then another sound, not from the trunk, but behind her. A footstep, slow, deliberate. "I had a feeling you'd come here," a voice murmured, a man smooth yet edged with something dangerous. Evelyn turned, meeting the dark eyes of a figure half shrouded in shadow. He wore a simple traveler's coat, his collar turned up against the cold, his stance too casual to be anything but calculated. He had been waiting for her, and she knew, without a doubt, that she had just stepped into a trap. The midnight express roared through the darkness, but for Evelyn Graves the true storm had only begun. The hush in the grand car was palpable, every passenger frozen in the grip of unease as Eleanor Woolf took a measured step forward, the gleam of the overhead chandelier catching the sharp contours of her gaze. "We are not merely passengers on an unfortunate voyage," she began, her voice steady, deliberate, "but witnesses to a crime that was calculated long before we ever boarded." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, anxious glances exchanged, hands gripping at the edges of velvet armrests. The conductor, his face drained of color, swallowed hard as Eleanor's gaze settled on him. "You heard raised voices in the engineer's compartment before departure, did you not?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but I couldn't make out who." "And yet," she continued smoothly, "you recall the tone. Agitation, fear." The conductor cast a wary glance at the inventor seated near the back, his nervous fingers twisting a handkerchief. "You, sir," Eleanor said, shifting her focus, admitted to replacing the brake system's component at the last moment. "Tell me, why would such an important modification be done so hastily?" The young man paled. I was told it was a simple part swap, a routine update." "Routine." Eleanor's lips curved, though there was no amusement in her expression, or deception. "Did you ever question who authorized it?" His silence was answer enough. "No harm was your intent," she conceded, "but ignorance does not absolve you from involvement." A sharp intake of breath came from the other end of the room. Lady Evelyn Moray, her delicate fingers clutching the locket at her throat, eyes darting anywhere but toward Eleanor. "And you, my lady," Eleanor pressed on, her voice softer now, almost conspiratorial. "You overheard the engineer's argument." "Two voices, not one. You did not speak of it immediately." "Why?" Lady Moray's breath hitched. I didn't think it relevant, yet you recall every inflection, every note of urgency," Eleanor countered. "Two men, arguing about something of dire consequence." She let the words linger, let their weight settle over the room. "Because, ladies and gentlemen," she continued, her voice now carrying the sharp edge of certainty, "this was no accident. This was a meticulously orchestrated event, and the man we knew as the engineer." She paused, let her gaze sweep over them. was an imposter. A collective gasp. The stage actress Mbom Corvallis stiffened in her chair, hands curled into the folds of her silk gown. "I saw him," she whispered, the words brittle, "twice. Once in uniform, once as a common traveler." Eleanor nodded. "Not a trick of the light, not a mistake. The engineer was replaced before we ever left the station, and the true engineer," she exhaled. Silenced. The room reeled in stunned silence, save for the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels beneath them. The truth was dawning. The train had not merely been sabotaged, it had been transformed into a perfect trap. And somewhere within this very room, the architect of this deception sat, hidden behind a mask of innocence. But not for long. Eleanor's piercing gaze settled on one passenger in particular. The tension coiled tighter. The game was nearly over. The crisp night air seeped through the fractured frame of the observation car, carrying with it the distant echo of rushing water far below. Celeste Harrow tightened her grip on the crumpled invoice she had unearthed among the debris, a seemingly routine order for a modified pressure valve, placed under a name that did not match any of the crew. The ink bore an unmistakable flourish, a distinctive curl she had seen before, buried in the personnel records of dismissed railway staff. The implications struck her like the frigid wind howling through the shattered window panes. The engineer, the man entrusted with guiding this train through treacherous mountain passes, had never been the engineer at all. He had been a ghost, a man erased from official rosters months ago after a disciplinary hearing marked by quiet whispers and swiftly signed termination papers. His dismissal had been abrupt, his skills deemed insufficient, his anger left simmering beneath the surface, and yet he had returned, not as a man seeking justice, but as a spectre orchestrating catastrophe. Celeste's gaze swept over the wreckage-strewn car, where passengers now clung to the fragile illusion of safety. Each of them had been unwitting participants in a game far older than any of them realized, a game of deception and revenge, played with the lives of those who simply happened to be aboard. But why now? Why here, in the dead of night, on a stretch of track so perilous it required an expert's hand? The answer, she suspected, lay not in the sabotage itself but in the meticulous planning that preceded it. A staged argument in the control cabin, designed to be overheard. A last-minute mechanical adjustment, performed by an unsuspecting apprentice, too eager to question orders. And then the final touch, the imposter engineer vanishing before the first jolt of disaster, leaving behind a hastily scrawled message in the dust. "Not my fault." A feeble attempt to redirect suspicion, to paint himself as a victim, rather than the architect of this chaos. But Celeste knew better. He had anticipated the wreck, he had prepared an escape, and now while the survivors grappled with confusion, he was already slipping away, each passing second, carrying him further from the disaster he had orchestrated. She exhaled, turning her gaze to the gathered passengers, aristocrats and factory magnates, scholars and drifters, all trapped in the same unfolding nightmare. Some trembled with barely concealed terror, others clutched at their belongings as if material possessions could ward off the truth. One among them had seen something, heard something, she had no doubt, and as she stepped forward, her voice cut through the hushed murmur like the crack of ice breaking underfoot. This was no accident, she declared, the weight of certainty anchoring her words. It was an execution. The room inhaled collectively. A glass slipped from a trembling hand, shattering against the polished wood. She let the silence linger, let the gravity of the moment settle deep in their bones. Then with measured precision, she turned her gaze to the one passenger who had remained unnervingly composed, the one whose breathing had never faltered, whose hands bore no signs of tremors. The true game was only beginning. The wreckage of the train lay in eerie stillness, moonlight casting jagged shadows over the twisted metal and shattered glass. Celeste Harrow stood at the heart of it all, her gaze unwavering as she pieced together the invisible lines of a conspiracy so meticulously woven that even the most cunning minds aboard had failed to see it unraveling in real time. The modified braking system, The engineers' staged outbursts, the carefully planted technical malfunctions, every element had been orchestrated, not to create a mere accident, but to seed doubt, to obscure the true motive. The passengers had assumed they were victims of mechanical failure, an unfortunate tragedy of faulty engineering. But Celeste knew better. This was not the work of an angry saboteur or an envious rival. It was the cold, calculated move of someone with far more at stake than personal vengeance. The answer, she announced, her voice sharp against the thick silence of the ruined cabin, does not lie with the engineer, or even with those of us aboard. It lies with the company itself. A murmur rippled through the assembled survivors. The company, an institution revered for its innovation, now struggling beneath the weight of financial ruin. Celeste could see it clearly now, the invisible strings pulled by unseen hands, the failed business ventures, the dwindling public trust, and then, a desperate maneuver masquerading as misfortune. Someone within the company saw this train not as a beacon of progress, but as their last bargaining chip. She continued, pacing slowly, letting the tension coil tighter with each measured step. A train derailed is a tragedy. A train lost under mysterious circumstances. A profitable catastrophe. A sharp intake of breath. Lady Winslow clutched at her pearls. The young inventor shifted uneasily. Even the conductor, whose face had remained a mask of calm, betrayed the faintest tremor in his hands. A well-placed disaster, Celeste pressed on, would mean an insurance payout large enough to erase debts, restore lost fortunes, and eliminate the competition in one fell swoop. And all they needed was one simple factor: chaos. A storm of unanswered questions, a villain so conveniently placed that no one would think to look any further. Her gaze swept over them, landing on a man who had remained unnervingly silent, his posture rigid, his fingers idly smoothing the fabric of his coat, a habit, she noted, of a man accustomed to negotiating under pressure. A high-ranking executive, one with the authority to approve last-minute modifications, one with the means to pay off a dismissed engineer, to orchestrate mechanical failures, to ensure the perfect scapegoat was in place before the first bolt even loosened. The tension in the air thickened, suffocating. Then, as if the weight of the truth had finally settled upon them all, the conductor exhaled shakily. "I'll contact the authorities," he whispered. Celeste inclined her head, the faintest smirk ghosting her lips. Good. The sooner, the better. But even as the passengers turned inward, hushed conversations blooming in cautious murmurs, she knew her work wasn't done. The executive was already calculating his next move, crafting his defense in the shadows of his own undoing. But Celeste Harrow was not one to let a guilty man slip through the cracks. Not when the game had only just begun.